Cameron Price leaned across the white linen table, slid the diamond ring from Alyssa's finger with two casual fingers, and set it beside the bread plate like it was a cufflink he'd forgotten to return. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't even look sorry. "We're done," he said. "Sophia fits the life I'm building. You never did." The restaurant went silent. 40 people heard every word. And Alyssa sat there in the burgundy dress he had picked out for her in the seat he had assigned her at the dinner he had engineered, and understood in one devastating second that tonight had never been an anniversary. It had been a removal. Before we go any further, if this story already has your blood up, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Alyssa had been running 11 minutes late, which for her was practically a catastrophe. She was the kind of woman who arrived early to everything: job sites, client meetings, dentist appointments, because being late meant losing control of the room before you'd even walked into it. But tonight the cab had gotten stuck behind a film crew blocking West 54th, and by the time she pushed through the glass doors of Maison Verlaine, she was breathless and her hair was doing something unfortunate on the left side. Cameron was already at the table. He stood when he saw her, and for a moment the sight of him in his charcoal suit with his politician's smile smoothed over the anxiety in her chest. He was handsome in that particular way that photographs: well-strong jaw, easy confidence, the kind of face that belonged on campaign posters, which was increasingly the point. "You're late," he said, and kissed her cheek without warmth. "Film crew on 54th. She slid into her chair, set her bag down, and looked around. The table was set for 3. She counted the glasses. 3. She looked at Cameron. "Are we expecting someone?" "Old friend," he said, and signaled the waiter. "Drink." She should have pushed. She knew it later, turning the evening over in her mind the way you turn a splinter you can't quite reach. She should have said, "Who's old friend, and why didn't you tell me, and why are there 3 glasses at our anniversary dinner?" But she didn't. She ordered sparkling water and told herself she was being paranoid, that the years of watching him manage every room had made her read manipulation into ordinary hospitality. The bread arrived. The amuse-bouche arrived. Cameron talked about a zoning meeting he'd attended that afternoon, about a city councilman who was positioning himself for the comptroller race, and about the way political momentum worked. Like architecture, you had to pour the foundation long before anyone could see what you were building. Alyssa listened and nodded and occasionally contributed because she understood architecture, literal and otherwise, better than most. She had rebuilt herself from a 1-bedroom in the Bronx and a scholarship in 6 years of 70-hour weeks into a name that people in Manhattan development circles actually knew. She was proud of that. She had earned every inch of it. She noticed the moment Sophia Hartwell walked in because the room noticed first. It wasn't that Sophia was spectacularly beautiful, though she was certainly that. It was the particular way she moved, like someone who had grown up being watched and had learned to give the watchers exactly what they came for. She was in a midnight blue dress that probably cost more than Alyssa's first paycheck at the firm. Her dark hair was pinned up with the effortless precision that takes 2 hours to achieve. And she was walking directly toward their table with a smile that wasn't surprised at all. Cameron stood up. Alyssa's stomach dropped before her brain caught up. "Sophia," he pulled out the 3rd chair. "I'm glad you made it." "Wouldn't miss it." Sophia sat, crossed her ankles, and turned that smile on Alyssa with the practiced warmth of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "You must be Alyssa. Cameron's told me so much about you." Alyssa looked at Cameron. "Who is this?" "Sophia Hartwell. Her father is Senator Hartwell." He said it the way you explain something to someone who should already know, with the faint impatience of a man who has run out of patience he never had to begin with. "We've been working together on the Waterfront Development Initiative." "Working together," Alyssa repeated, "professionally." He picked up his wine and drank, not meeting her eyes. The waiter appeared and recited the evening's specials. Alyssa heard none of it. She was watching Sophia arrange her napkin in her lap with the unhurried ease of a woman who belonged exactly where she was sitting, and she was watching Cameron watch Sophia with an expression she had never once seen him turn on, her open, unguarded, quietly pleased, like a man looking at something he had spent a long time working toward and had finally gotten his hands on. "Cameron," her voice was low, "can I speak with you for a moment privately? We have a guest." "I'm aware we have a guest. That's exactly what I want to talk about." Sophia reached for her water glass and looked away with the tact of someone who had been briefed on what was about to happen and had decided to let it play out. Cameron set his wine down. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything when he was preparing to control a conversation. Alyssa, don't. Don't what? Don't make this into something it isn't. Then tell me what it is. She kept her voice perfectly steady. She was good at that. Years of presenting designs to rooms full of men who were already looking for reasons to dismiss her work had made her very good at keeping her voice steady while everything inside her was fracturing. Explain to me why you have a woman I've never met sitting at our anniversary dinner. Because, Cameron said, I didn't see the point in waiting any longer. The table beside theirs had gone quiet. She felt it the specific quality of silence that meant other people had started listening. Waiting for what? Cameron looked at her then, really looked at her with the kind of directness that should have been a kindness but wasn't. Alyssa, you're brilliant. You work harder than anyone I know. But the life I'm building, the career I'm moving into it, requires a certain kind of partner. Someone who understands this world. He glanced at Sophia briefly, almost involuntarily. Someone who was raised in it. The words landed one at a time like weights being stacked on a scale. You're ending our engagement, Alyssa said. It wasn't a question. Her voice came out flat and precise, the way her voice always went when she was refusing to let herself feel something in real time. I think it's better if we're honest with each other. Honest, she almost laughed. The word was so clean, and he was using it to do something so brutal. You brought her here, tonight, to our table. Her jaw tightened. You made me put on this dress. Something flickered in his expression, not guilt, she realized. Impatience. The dress is irrelevant. You called me this morning and told me specifically to wear the burgundy one. You said it was important. Her voice cracked on the last word just barely, and she hated herself for it. Why did that matter if you were going to do this? Cameron leaned back in his chair. Around them, the restaurant had shifted into that electric, awful stillness that a public scene creates, people pretending not to listen while listening with their whole bodies. Because I needed tonight to look a certain way, he said, and the honesty in it was somehow worse than any lie would have been. There are photographers outside. There will be coverage. I needed you present for this conversation so that when Sophia and I appear in the same space publicly from here forward, the narrative is clean, that I ended things, that it was mutual. Alyssa stared at him. Something moved through her chest, not quite heartbreak, not yet, because heartbreak takes a moment to arrive when the shock is large enough. What she felt was something colder and more precise. Recognition. This had been a stage set. She had been a prop. You used me. Her voice was almost a whisper. I handled a difficult situation practically. He reached across the table and picked up his wine glass again. It's what I do. Sophia had not moved. She sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes down, playing the role of the woman who had nothing to do with any of this, despite being the reason for all of it. Remove your ring, Cameron said quietly. Alyssa looked down at her hand, the solitaire she had worn for 14 months that she had fallen asleep looking at in the early weeks when she still believed that she had found the person she was going to build a life with. She had loved that ring, not for what it cost, but for what she'd believed it meant. The whole story she'd told herself about this man and this future, and the kind of love she deserved after years of putting everything else first. She pulled it off herself, slowly, and set it on the table between them. I'm not going to give you a scene, she said. I'm not going to cry, and I'm not going to scream, and I'm not going to give those photographers outside a single usable image. She pushed her chair back and stood. But I want you to know something, Cameron. I want you to understand this very clearly. She looked at him without flinching. Whatever you're building, the career, the image, the version of your life, where everything is curated and controlled and performed, you will not build it on what I gave you. Because what I gave you was real, and you will spend a very long time in rooms full of people who are performing right along with you, and you will eventually understand what it cost you to throw that away. She picked up her bag. She picked up the roll of blueprints she'd brought to show him plans for a mixed-use development on the Lower East Side that she had spent 3 months drafting, that she'd wanted his opinion on, that she had believed somehow even tonight that he was still the kind of partner who would want to look at her work. She walked out. The cold hit her the moment she pushed through the restaurant doors, and for a moment she stood on the sidewalk and simply breathed because she didn't know what else to do with her body. The blueprints were tucked under one arm. Her heels were wrong for the pavement. There were, as Cameron had warned, two photographers loitering near the valet stand, and she turned away from them, instinctively moving toward the narrow gap between Maison Verlaine and the building beside it. The side street was darker, quieter. She stopped walking when she reached the middle of it, pressed her back against the cold brick, and finally let herself feel it, all of it, the whole enormous weight of the evening, in the 2 seconds she was going to allow herself before she pulled it back together. Her eyes stung, her throat tightened, the blueprints crinkled against her ribs as she exhaled. She had planned to marry that man in 9 months. She had looked at venues. She had told her mother, who had cried in the kitchen of her apartment in the Bronx, and said, "Finally, baby. Finally, someone who sees what you're worth." She had told her work partner, Dana, who had immediately started talking about the bachelorette party. She had rearranged the architecture of her entire future around the assumption of him. And he had chosen the dress. That was the detail she couldn't let go of, standing there on the cold pavement with her breath misting in the November air and her ring finger bare and stinging. He had called her at 8:30 that morning and told her specifically to wear the burgundy one because it photographed beautifully, and she had thought he was being romantic and attentive, and the whole time he had been staging his own performance, and she had been the unwitting extra in it. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and refused to cry. "You're going to freeze." The voice came from the far end of the alley. Unhurried calm with a low texture to it that suggested a man who had never once in his life felt the need to raise his volume to be heard. She spun around. He was standing at the edge of the streetlight, tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 30s, in a dark coat that looked like it had been made specifically for him. He was watching her with an expression that was neither alarmed nor intrusive, simply observant, the way a man watches something that has captured his attention and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. Alyssa's architect's eye cataloged him in the first 2 seconds, the way it cataloged everything: proportions, weight, structural integrity. He was built like someone who had spent his life in situations that required him to hold things together by force of will. Dark hair, dark eyes, a face that was neither warm nor cold, but something more precise still. "I'm fine," she said, which was such an obvious lie that she was almost embarrassed to have said it. "You're also holding blueprints in a side alley at 8:45 at night in November. It's been an unusual evening." "I imagine it has." He didn't move closer, didn't move at all, just stood at that same unhurried distance, which was somehow more disarming than if he had approached. "There are cameras at the front. I noticed you came this way to avoid them." She studied him. "Who are you, Thomas D'Angelo?" The name landed without fanfare, spoken the way a man states a fact that has always been true and will continue to be true, regardless of whether anyone finds it remarkable. She filed it away without recognizing it, which was its own kind of information. The name belonged to a world she'd been adjacent to, but never inside. "Why are you in this alley, Thomas D'Angelo?" "Same reason you are. I prefer the quieter exits." Something about the way he said it, the absolute evenness of it, loosened something in her chest. She hadn't expected humor, or whatever that was. She hadn't expected any response that made sense. "The man at the table, Thomas said. "The one in the charcoal suit." Alyssa went still. "Were you watching?" "I was having dinner. The restaurant is not large." A pause. "He is a fool." She laughed before she could stop herself. A single involuntary exhale of sound that surprised her so completely that she pressed her free hand to her sternum as though she could push it back in. That's one word for it." "I have others." "I'll bet you do." She straightened, adjusted the blueprints under her arm, and looked at him with the clear-eyed directness that had always been her first and best defense. "What do you want?" He tilted his head slightly, like the question had genuinely interested him. "My car is at the end of this block. I noticed you have no cab, and the photographers at the front will certainly recognize a woman in a burgundy dress emerging from an alley, especially when they've just photographed her fiancé dining with Sophia Hartwell." He said Sophia's name with the particular flatness of a man who has cataloged many powerful people's children and found very few of them worth the distinction. "I can have you out of this block in 40 seconds. Alyssa looked at him for a long moment. Every sensible instinct told her that accepting a ride from a stranger in an alley after the worst evening of her life was not a decision that ended well. But the photographers were still at the front. Cameron's carefully engineered narrative was already in motion, and there was something about this man, the stillness of him, the specificity of his attention, the way he had said he is a fool without any attempt to soften it or make it more palatable, that made her not afraid of him. Which was itself a strange thing to realize. She was usually afraid of powerful men. He was obviously powerful, and she wasn't afraid. 40 seconds, she said, 42 at most. She moved toward him. He turned without another word and walked to the end of the alley, and she followed him out onto a side street where a black car idled at the curb. Not a town car, not a showroom. Luxury vehicle, but something understated and heavy and serious. The kind of car that didn't need to announce itself because it had never needed to announce anything. The door was opened from the inside by a driver who didn't speak, and Thomas held it for her with a gesture so natural it wasn't a performance. She got in. He walked around and got in on the other side. The car moved. She sat with her blueprints in her lap and looked out the window as Manhattan slid past, and for 30 seconds neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was the strangest part of everything. "Where would you like to go?" he asked. "I live in Tribeca." "Address?" She gave it. He said nothing. The driver apparently already knew. Another long pause. The city outside was its usual indifferent brilliance, 10,000 lit windows, the flash of a siren 3 blocks north, the permanent hum of a place that never fully slept and never fully cared. "Cameron Price," Thomas said. Not a question. "You know him." "I know of him. He's positioning for a congressional seat. He's been meeting with the Hartwell family for approximately 7 months." He said it with the casual precision of a man who is accustomed to knowing things that most people don't. Sophia Hartwell's father controls several significant endorsements in this city. A relationship between them would be politically convenient. Alyssa stared at him. "How do you know that?" "It's my business to know things." He looked at her, and in the dim light of the car, she could see that his eyes were not simply dark, they were watchful with a quality of layered attention that she associated with people who had survived things. "He's been building toward this for longer than 7 months. He chose you carefully, I imagine. An accomplished woman, credible, no connections to scandal. Good for the early image. And then when the Hartwell opportunity became concrete, he needed a clean exit." He paused. "Hence the dress." She felt the words like a blade precisely applied. "You're telling me this entire engagement was a calculation." "I'm telling you that men like Cameron Price don't make decisions that aren't calculations." No apology in his voice, no softening. Just the fact of it delivered with the kind of honesty that is simultaneously a cruelty and a gift. "You deserve to know. Whatever you do with it is your own business." She looked at her bare ring finger, looked at it for a long moment, and then something shifted inside her, not toward despair, but away from it, toward a harder, cleaner place. She had built things before from nothing. She had walked into rooms where no one believed she belonged and made them believe it by the time she walked out. She was not going to let Cameron Price reduce her. She was not going to let the dress win. "What is it you actually do, Thomas D'Angelo?" she asked. The corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile. "I manage situations." "What kind, Bon? The kind other people can't manage." She held his gaze. He held hers back without effort or performance. "The kind," she said slowly, "that would include someone like Cameron Price." There was a silence in the car that felt different from the silences before it, more deliberate, like a door being held open rather than left closed. Thomas D'Angelo looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly and without any particular drama, "I have a proposition for you." And the city kept moving, past the windows, indifferent as ever, as Alyssa sat in the back of a car that didn't belong to her world, across from a man she didn't know, and felt for the first time since Cameron had taken her ring off the table with 2 idle fingers, the unmistakable sensation of something shifting in her favor. She didn't say yes yet. She didn't say anything. She just looked at Thomas D'Angelo and waited. And waiting for the first time that night, Baike felt like a choice she was making herself. "A proposition," Alyssa repeated. She said it the way she said everything when she was processing something she hadn't decided about yet, flat careful with the specific neutrality of a woman who had learned a long time ago that showing your hand before you understood the game was how you lost it. Thomas didn't rush her. That was the first thing she noticed about him, as a consistent quality he did not rush. He sat in the back of that car with his hands resting on his knees, and looked at her with the patience of someone who had made many offers in his life and understood that the ones worth making were the ones the other person needed a moment to absorb. "You don't have to answer tonight," he said. "I haven't heard it yet." "No," he watched her. "You haven't." Outside Manhattan moved past in that relentless way it had, as if the city had somewhere more important to be. She was aware of the driver in the front present, but invisible the way Thomas's people apparently learned to be. She was aware of the blueprints in her lap, the cold she'd carried in from the alley, still sitting in her shoulders, the bare weight of her left hand. "Then say it," she said, "whatever it is." Thomas looked at her for one more moment, the kind of look that was actually an assessment, that was measuring something she couldn't quite name, and then he spoke with the directness of a man who had no interest in packaging things attractively. "Marry me. 6 months. A contract. You live in my apartment, attend events with me, behave in every public setting as my wife. At the end of 6 months, you walk away with $2 million and your career intact." He paused. "And Cameron Price never runs for anything again." The car was very quiet. Alyssa heard herself breathe. She heard the city. She heard the faint sound of her own heartbeat making itself known the way it did when something enormous had just entered the room, and her body understood it before her mind caught up. "You're serious," she said. "I don't make jokes about contracts." $2 million. She repeated the number the way you repeat something in a foreign language, to hear if it sounds real when your own voice carries it. "And Cameron's career. His career will not survive what I'm in a position to expose. He's been taking discretionary funds from a community development grant that his office administers. He's been doing it for 8 months. The documentation exists." Thomas said it without heat, without satisfaction, as a man recites a column of facts. The right journalist receives the right information at the right time. That is all it takes. Alyssa stared at him. "How long have you known that?" "Long enough. Why haven't you used it already?" Something shifted in his expression, subtle, barely there, but she caught it. "Because I didn't have a reason to yet." She felt the weight of that answer settle over her. It was not a comfortable weight. It meant that Thomas D'Angelo moved in a world where information was stored like ammunition, patient and dry until the moment it was needed. It meant that she was currently sitting in a car with a man who collected leverage on people the way other men collected business cards, and that she was being offered a seat inside that machinery. "What do you need a wife for?" she asked, not accusing, genuinely asking. He was quiet for a moment, then, "There are business interests I'm trying to formalize. Partnerships that require a level of social credibility that my current profile doesn't offer." A pause. "The people I'm negotiating with are conservative, family-oriented. They need to believe they're working with the man who has settled interests, not a man who operates alone. You need a cover story. I need a partner who is credible, composed, and intelligent enough to hold a convincing position in rooms full of people who will be looking for cracks." He held her gaze. "You held a convincing position tonight at a table where a man was actively dismantling you. That is not nothing." She felt something move in her chest at that not flattery, because it wasn't delivered as flattery. It was an observation, a cold, accurate, oddly respectful observation. "What are your business interests?" she asked. "Varied." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I'm giving you tonight." He said it without apology. "What I will tell you is that nothing I'm asking you to do is illegal. You attend dinners, galas, meetings. You are present. You are convincing. You are not asked to do anything that violates your own code, whatever that code is. And if I have questions about what you do, you will have questions. Everyone does." He tilted his head slightly. "Whether I answer them will depend on whether the questions are relevant to your safety and comfort, or whether they're curiosity about things that are not your concern." Alyssa looked at him for a long moment. She was good at reading rooms. She had spent her career in rooms where the power dynamics were never stated directly, but were always visible if you knew how to look. Who sat at the head of the table, whose ideas got repeated back to them as though they just had them, who apologized before they spoke, and who simply spoke. Thomas D'Angelo was the rarest thing she'd encountered in any room, a man who held enormous power and wore it so quietly that it almost disappeared. Almost. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course, Brittany's." The car stopped. She looked out and realized they were on her block in Tribeca, her building's familiar awning, the narrow street she'd walked 1,000 times. He had said Tribeca, and the driver had known. How did you know where I live? Thomas said nothing, which was its own answer. She got out of the car. Then she stopped, turned back, and looked at him through the open door. If I say yes, and I'm not saying yes, I have conditions. I'd expect nothing less. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she closed the door. She didn't sleep, not 1 hour of it. She lay in her bed in her apartment, with the city's low murmur coming through the window and her blueprints on the drafting table and her phone face down on the nightstand because she couldn't look at it. Dana had texted 14 times. Her mother had called twice. The story was already out. She knew that without looking. Cameron had wanted it out. He had engineered the timing, the location, the photographers, the narrative. By morning, it would be everywhere that appropriate people in appropriate circles needed it to be, and the version they would read was the one Cameron had written. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the dress. She thought about 14 months. She thought about the venues she'd looked at on her lunch breaks, photographing them on her phone with a private excitement she'd never fully allowed herself to show anyone because she had always been slightly afraid that joy displayed openly could be taken away. She had been right to be afraid. She just hadn't known the right thing to be afraid of. She got up at 5 in the morning, made coffee, and sat at her drafting table. Thomas D'Angelo. She had finally looked him up at 2 a.m. in the short window when she'd given up on sleep and permitted herself her phone. What she found was both more and less than she'd expected. There was a real estate holdings company, a construction investment firm, an import-export operation based out of New Jersey. His public profile was thin and precise, a man who appeared in photographs at the edges of important rooms rather than the center. She found 3 mentions of his name in newspaper archives, all of them brief, all of them involving legitimate business rather than anything else. But the legitimate business was very large, and the profile was too thin for a man with holdings that size, too curated. She knew what thin curated profiles meant. She had grown up in a neighborhood where certain men had thin curated profiles, and everyone understood what that meant without saying it. Thomas D'Angelo ran something, and what he ran was not entirely what was written on the corporate documents. She sat with her coffee and her blueprints and thought about $2 million. She thought about what $2 million would do for the architecture firm she had been trying to launch for 2 years, the one that existed currently as a business plan on her laptop and a dream she quietly maintained through 12-hour days at someone else's firm. She thought about what it would mean to own her work, her time, her name on the door. And then she thought about Cameron, about the way he had said the dress is irrelevant, about the way he had removed her ring and set it beside the bread plate with the same energy he used to set down his phone, as if she were something that had served its purpose and could now be put aside. By 6:15, she had made a decision. She was not at peace with it. She wasn't sure peace was available in the particular situation she was navigating. But she had made it cleanly and deliberately, the way she made all her decisions, by looking at the structure of the thing, mapping the load-bearing walls, identifying where it would hold and where it might give. She texted the number he had left on a card inside the car. She hadn't noticed him place it there. She'd found it when she reached into her coat pocket. The text said, "I have conditions." "When can we meet?" The response came in 4 minutes, which meant he was already awake, which meant he had been waiting. It said, "My office, 10 o'clock. She got there at 9:58 because she was not going to be late twice in the same 12 hours. The building was in Midtown, not ostentatious, not the kind of glass tower that announced money by volume, but a pre-war building that had been renovated with the specific restraint of someone who understood that old buildings with good bones didn't need to be improved, only maintained. She gave her name at the desk. She was expected. The office itself was on the 14th floor, large without being the kind of large that was trying to make a point. One of his people, a woman in her 40s with the quiet efficiency of someone who had worked for Thomas long enough to stop being surprised by anything, met her at the elevator and walked her in without ceremony. Thomas was at his desk. He stood when she entered. He was in a different coat than the night before, charcoal, precisely cut, and his expression was the same as it had been in the car, attentive and still. "Sit down," he said. "I will stand." She set her bag on the chair instead. "I said I had conditions." "You did. First, this is a business arrangement and nothing else. Whatever the public performance looks like, whatever we're required to project, the private arrangement is professional at all times. You respect my space. I respect yours. There is no gray area about that." He looked at her without expression. Agreed. Second, I continue working. My job, my hours, my clients, my own projects. This arrangement does not interfere with my professional life in any way. Also agreed. She looked at him. He was agreeing too quickly. She narrowed her eyes. Third, I want a lawyer to review the contract before I sign anything. My own lawyer, not one you provide. A pause, then, of course. Fourth, she took a breath. Whatever you're doing, whatever the actual work of your life is, I don't get touched by it. I'm not a part of it. I'm a name and a face in the rooms you need me in, and that is the limit of my involvement. This time the pause was longer. He turned slightly as though working through something internally, and when he looked back at her, his expression had shifted not dramatically, but perceptibly. Something that might have been respect. Those are reasonable conditions, he said. I accept them. She had expected negotiation. The immediate acceptance caught her off balance, and she hated that she let it show for the half second before she recovered. There's one more. Go ahead. Cameron, she held his gaze. It doesn't happen because you decide it happens. When it happens, whatever you're going to expose, I want to know first. I don't want to read it on a news feed. I want you to tell me. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Why does that matter? Because he humiliated me in front of 40 people, and I spent 14 months believing he loved me. And if his career is going to end, I want to be the one who knows it's coming before it does. Her voice didn't waver. I'm owed that much. Something passed through Thomas's face so quickly that she almost missed it. It was not sympathy exactly. It was something more complicated, something that recognized the specific weight of what she'd said without trying to reduce it. Agreed, he said. You'll know first. She stood there for a moment longer, and then she put her hand in her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, her own handwritten notes from 5 a.m. Her conditions, in her own words, organized the way she organized everything clearly without waste. She put it on his desk. That's what I need the contract to reflect, she said. He looked down at the paper, then back at her, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that functioned like surprise, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind, that a person feels when something is not what they expected, and the deviation is against all reasonable prediction better. I'll have the contract drafted today, he said. She nodded. She picked up her bag. She was halfway to the door when he spoke again. Alyssa. She stopped, didn't turn immediately. Then she did. He'll regret it, Thomas said, simply, without embellishment. Cameron Price will regret what he did to you. That's not a threat, it's a fact. Men like him always do eventually. I'm simply going to make eventually arrive sooner. She looked at him across the office and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in this room, in this arrangement, in this particular disaster of a morning, after something that was almost comfort. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't ready to thank him for anything yet, but she held his gaze for 2 seconds before she turned and walked out. And 2 seconds was in the vocabulary. They were apparently building together the beginning of something. The contract arrived at her lawyer's office at 3 that afternoon. Her lawyer, Patricia Gunn, called her at 3:45. Patricia had handled Alyssa's business agreements for 3 years and had the particular voice of a woman who had seen everything twice and was therefore immune to being rattled by anything new. This is airtight, Patricia said. Whoever drafted this knows what they're doing. Is anything in it that shouldn't be? There's a non-disclosure agreement that covers all aspects of his personal and professional life during and after the arrangement. It's broadly worded, but it's standard for this kind of contract. I've seen similar in high net worth prenups and corporate arrangements. And the payment structure, $1 million on the wedding date, $1 million on the dissolution date, 6 months guaranteed regardless of circumstances. There's also a clause that says, if either party terminates early for any reason, you still receive the full amount. Patricia paused. He's not giving himself an exit that costs you money. That's unusual. Alyssa sat at her desk at work and pressed the phone against her ear and stared at the wall. Would you sign it? Patricia was quiet for a moment. I'd want to know more about Thomas D'Angelo. I know some, and I think he keeps his word. She didn't know why she was certain about that, only that she was. He agreed to every condition I gave him this morning without negotiating any of them. Another pause. Then I'd say the contract is clean. What you sign it for is your decision. She signed it that evening, in his office again, across that same desk with Patricia present on speakerphone as witness. Thomas signed with a pen that looked like it had been used for 1,000 agreements. Before this one steady hand, no hesitation, no performance. When it was done, he set the pen down and looked at her. The wedding is Saturday. Alyssa blinked. This Saturday. Time matters in these arrangements. My business partners are expecting to meet my wife at a dinner next Thursday. That doesn't work if we aren't married by then. She stared at him. It's Wednesday. Yes. Thomas, it's Wednesday and you want to get married on Saturday. City Hall, 9 in the morning, no guests required. His tone was completely even, as though he were describing a meeting rather than a marriage. You can invite whoever you choose. I'll have one witness. Whatever you need for your own comfort is available. She laughed the same involuntary surprise laugh that had escaped her in the alley. My mother is going to think I've lost my mind. Have you? She considered the question with more genuine seriousness than he'd probably intended it. I think I've made a rational decision in an irrational situation. That, Thomas said, is the most sensible thing either of us has said today. She went home that night and called her mother last. She called Dana first because Dana would process the information loudly and immediately, and Alyssa needed to have already survived one reaction before she tackled the harder one. Dana did not disappoint. There were several minutes of escalating exclamations followed by a long silence, and then Dana said, "Is he at least attractive? That's your first substantive question. I'm working my way up to the important ones." Yes, he's attractive. That's not the point. It's not the point, Dana said. Alyssa, I love you. I have known you for 11 years. You have done everything the right way your entire life, and last night Cameron Price publicly humiliated you at a table you sat at in a dress he picked out. And now you're telling me a man showed up in an alley and offered you $2 million and revenge. And you signed the contract. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. I'm going to tell you that I'll be at City Hall on Saturday and I'll bring the good champagne. Her mother was harder. Her mother listened to the whole story without interrupting, which was unusual enough that Alyssa found it more unnerving than the alternative. When she finished, the silence on the phone stretched long enough that she said, "Mom," just to confirm the call was still connected. "I'm here," her mother said. "I'm thinking." Another silence. "He picked out the dress," her mother finally said. "Yes. Cameron picked out the dress and told you to wear it, and then he sat you at the table and took your ring off in front of people." "Yes." She heard her mother exhale, and then in the quiet, steady voice of a woman who had raised a daughter alone in the Bronx and worked double shifts and watched that daughter build something real from pure determination, her mother said, "Then you do what you need to do. And this Thomas, if he hurts you, I don't care who he is or what he runs. He won't hurt me." "How do you know?" Alyssa thought about the car, the alley. He is a fool. The 4 conditions she had laid down and the 4 times he had said agreed without flinching. "Because I made sure of it," she said, "on paper." Her mother was quiet again. Then Saturday, 9 in the morning, City Hall. "I'll make the drive." A pause. "Wear something you chose yourself." Alyssa smiled. For the first time since the night before, the smile reached something real. "I will," she said. She wore ivory. Not white, not the elaborate construction of a traditional wedding dress, but a clean, structured ivory dress that she had bought 2 years ago for a colleague's gala and always loved and never found quite the right occasion for. She stood in City Hall on a gray November Saturday morning, with Dana on one side and her mother on the other, and looked across the small room at Thomas D'Angelo, who wore a dark suit and stood with his one witness, a man named Caruso, who had the particular build of someone whose primary professional function was being large and unreadable. And she thought, "This is the most unusual thing I have ever done." And then the city clerk began to speak, and Thomas turned and looked at her with those still watchful eyes, and something in the quality of his attention made her stand straighter without meaning to, because his attention was not the attention of a man performing for an audience. There was no audience. It was just the 2 of them and 4 other people in a government building on a Saturday morning, and he was looking at her like she was the only fixed point in the room. When the clerk reached the vows, Thomas repeated them in a low, even voice, and she felt every word land with a strange and inappropriate gravity, as though the contract they had already signed was one thing, and these words were somehow another thing entirely heavier and less explainable. She repeated her own. Her voice didn't shake. He slid a ring onto her finger, plain white gold, clean-lined, nothing like Cameron's elaborate solitaire, nothing chosen to impress or perform, just a ring. But it was warm from his hand and it fit, and she didn't know how he had known her size. The clerk said, "You may kiss the bride," and there was a half-second of something, a flicker of mutual awareness of two people arriving simultaneously at the same pragmatic conclusion, and then Thomas leaned in and pressed his mouth briefly formally to her cheek. Warm. His hand came to her shoulder for just a moment, steady and then gone. Her mother made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. Alyssa looked at the ring on her hand and thought very quietly, very clearly, "Whatever this is, it is mine. I chose it. He did not choose it for me. That was enough. For now, it was enough." The apartment was on the 31st floor of a building in the West Village that didn't have a sign out front and didn't need one. Thomas's people had moved her things while she was at work on Monday: 3 boxes of clothes, her drafting supplies, her coffee maker, which she had insisted on personally, and the blueprints. She had insisted on the blueprints too. The movers had handled them like they were documents that mattered, which told her something about the kind of instructions Thomas gave to the people who worked for him. She stood in the apartment that first Sunday evening with her boxes still half unpacked and tried to understand the space the way she understood all spaces by reading what it said about the person who had chosen it. The apartment said precision, it said restraint, it said a man who had very strong opinions about what belonged in a room and very little patience for things that didn't earn their place. There were books, real ones, red ones with the spines cracked and the pages marked. There was no art on the walls that looked like it had been purchased to fill space. What was there had been chosen. She could see it in the way each piece sat deliberate, unmovable, like someone had decided where it lived and the decision had been final. Thomas was in his study when she arrived. He came out to meet her for approximately 90 seconds, said her room was the second door on the left, said there was food in the kitchen and she was welcome to whatever she needed, and then said he had calls to finish and excused himself. Clean, efficient, exactly as agreed. She stood in the hallway after he'd gone and realized with a clarity that surprised her that she was relieved. She unpacked the coffee maker first. The Thursday dinner arrived faster than she was ready for it. Thomas appeared at her door at 6:15, knocked, waited, did not open it himself. And when she opened it, he looked at her for 1 second and said, "That works." Coming from him, she had already begun to understand that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Who are these people?" she asked as Caruso drove them cross town through the early evening traffic. "The Marchetti family." Thomas looked at his phone, then put it in his jacket pocket with the focused stillness of a man setting work aside when work needed to be set aside. "Antonio Marchetti, 63, runs a construction supply company across the Northeast. His wife, Elena. Their son, Marco, who manages the family's newer investments. They are particular about the people they partner with. Particular how they come from a specific tradition," Thomas said. The phrasing was careful. "Loyalty matters to them more than most other things. Family stability signals loyalty." She looked at him. "So I'm the signal. You're part of the arrangement, yes." He met her eyes without apology. "I told them we married quickly because we'd been together for some time privately. You were private about your personal life because of your career. That's all they need to know and all we need to say. And if they ask about our relationship, tell the truth about the parts that are true. You're an architect. You work hard. You care about your work." A pause. "The rest is performance. You're good at that. I watched you hold yourself together at that restaurant under circumstances that would have undone most people. This will be considerably less difficult than that." She said nothing. He was right, and she didn't especially want to agree with him out loud yet because she was still in the portion of this arrangement where agreeing with him felt like conceding something she wasn't ready to concede. The restaurant was private, the kind with no menu posted outside, no walk-in welcome, just a door that opened when you arrived because someone was already expecting you. Antonio Marchetti stood when they entered, a broad, compact man with white hair and the handshake of someone who had been using it as a character assessment tool for 40 years. He clasped Thomas's hand and then turned to Alyssa with an expression that was measuring without being unkind. "So," Antonio said, holding her hand in both of his, This is the woman who finally made Thomas D'Angelo move quickly. Thomas said, "She makes everything she does look like it was planned that way." Alyssa turned to look at him involuntarily. It was not what she'd expected him to say. It was not transactional. It was specific, accurate in a way that meant he'd been paying attention. She recovered in half a breath and turned back to Antonio with a smile that was warm because oddly it wanted to be. "He moves quickly too," she said. "He just makes it look like patience." Antonio laughed, the real kind, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. Beside him, Elena Marchetti, a slim woman with sharp dark eyes and the quiet authority of someone who had run a household and a family's social world simultaneously for 30 years, looked at Alyssa with a different kind of measurement. Not hostile, thorough. "You're an architect," Elena said. "I am." "What do you build?" "Right now, other people's projects. I'm working toward my own firm." She said it the way she always said it, without apology, without the hedge she'd been socialized to add when admitting to ambition in mixed company. "Mixed-use development. I think the best buildings serve multiple kinds of lives at once." Elena held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Sit next to me at dinner." Marco Marchetti was 29 and had his mother's eyes and his father's tendency to assess everything by its structural integrity, which meant he and Alyssa spent the first half of dinner talking about load distribution in high-rise construction, while Thomas and Antonio discussed whatever they discussed in the particular shorthand of men who had been having versions of the same conversation for years. It was not Alyssa discovered entirely unpleasant. Marco was sharp and genuinely curious and didn't talk over her, which moved him immediately into the upper quartile of professional dinner companions she had experienced. But it was Elena who mattered. She understood that instinctively within the first 10 minutes. Somewhere between the second course and the third, Elena leaned toward her slightly and said in a voice pitched low, "How long have you actually known him?" Alyssa looked at her. Elena's expression was not suspicious, exactly more the look of a woman who has been in enough rooms and heard enough stories to understand when a story has been adjusted for public consumption. "Not as long as the story implies," Alyssa said. She held Elena's gaze. "But I know enough." Elena studied her for a long moment. Then she said, "He never brought anyone before, in 12 years. Not to any dinner, any event, nothing." She glanced briefly at Thomas. "Whatever the actual story is, he chose you deliberately. That means something coming from him." Alyssa followed her gaze and found Thomas already looking at her from across the table. He looked away immediately back to Antonio, seamless, but she had caught it. 2 seconds at most. Eyes that had been on her before she looked up. She picked up her wine and turned back to Elena. "It means something coming from me too," she said. "I don't make decisions I'm not sure about." Elena smiled. Small, real. "No," she said. "I can see that." The dinner ended well. Antonio shook Thomas's hand again at the door and then surprised Alyssa by kissing her cheek in the European fashion and saying in her ear, "Take care of him. He is harder to replace than he thinks." She didn't know what to do with that, so she simply nodded and smiled and filed it away under the growing category of things about Thomas D'Angelo that she did not yet fully understand. In the car going back, she said Elena knew. "Elena always knows," Thomas said. "It doesn't matter. She's not going to say anything. Elena Marchetti has kept larger secrets than ours for longer than we've been alive. She cares about 2 things, whether you're genuine and whether you're loyal. She's decided you're both." Alyssa looked out the window. "How do you know what she decided?" "Because Antonio shook my hand and said we should move forward with the partnership." A pause. "He has never in 12 years agreed to move forward with anything after a single dinner. Elena's approval is the gate. She's the gate, always has been." She turned to look at him. He was watching the city the same way he always watched things, not vacantly, but with a specific quality of attention that suggested he was processing more than he was showing. "You knew that going in," she said. "You knew it would come down to Elena." "I hoped. And you still trusted me to handle it. Without a script, without preparation." He looked at her then, the same even assessing look, but with something slightly different in it tonight, something that had been worn down fractionally by the evening, by the dinner, by whatever it had cost him to sit across from Antonio Marchetti and be seen with another person in a way he apparently never was. "Yes," he said, "I trusted you." She looked at her hands in her lap. at the plain white gold ring on her left hand. "That's a significant thing," she said quietly, "for someone who manages everything." He said nothing, but he didn't look away. It was the closest thing to a real moment they'd had, and it lasted approximately 4 seconds before the car stopped at a light and a bike messenger nearly clipped the side mirror, and Thomas said something sharp to Caruso about the route. And the moment dissolved the way moments do when men are better at managing situations than feelings. She let it go. She stored it the way she stored all structural information filed accessible relevant for later. The story broke on a Wednesday, 11 days into their arrangement, 3 days after the Marchetti dinner, on a morning when Alyssa was in the middle of a site review call with a contractor who could not understand why the load calculations she had sent him were correct, despite being different from what he was used to. Her phone lit up with Thomas's name. She stepped out of the call. "It's happening today," Thomas said. "The Times has the documentation. It publishes at noon." She went very still. "Today. You said you wanted to know first." She stood in the corridor of her office building and looked at the wall and breathed. She had known it was coming. She had agreed to it, had made it a condition of the contract, had understood from the beginning that it was the mechanism, the point, the engine of the arrangement. Knowing it was coming had not made the arrival of it feel the way she'd expected. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Career ending. No embellishment. No satisfaction that she could detect. The documentation shows a pattern over 8 months. It's not ambiguous." She pressed her hand flat against the wall. "And Sophia," a pause. "Her name appears in several of the relevant communications. She knew." Another pause. "Her father has already retained 3 lawyers as of this morning. So Senator Hartwell is going down with him. The senator is a separate matter. What I can tell you with certainty is that Cameron Price will not be running for any office in this city. Not this cycle, not the next." She stood there for a long moment. The corridor was empty. Somewhere behind her, her contractor was probably still on hold, waiting with his incorrect calculations and his incomprehension. "Alyssa," Thomas's voice steady, "are you all right?" It was such a simple, direct question. She hadn't expected it. She hadn't expected him to ask. "I'm angry," she said, and the honesty of it surprised her the way real feelings that have been correctly named always do. "I thought I'd feel something cleaner than this. I thought I'd feel satisfied. But I'm just angry. I'm angry that it was real, all of it, the whole calculation, and I trusted him." Silence on the line. "That's the appropriate feeling," Thomas said finally. "Satisfaction comes later. Anger means you understand what was done to you." She exhaled slowly. "Okay. Okay. Let it run." She pushed off the wall. "Let the story run." She went back into her contractor call, fixed his calculations, finished the review, and at 12:03, when the New York Times article went live under the headline, "Cameron Price Racine Political Star, Under Investigation for Misuse of Public Funds," she was at her desk reviewing the Lower East Side blueprints, and she read the whole thing without stopping, once without flinching, and at the end of it, she set her phone face down on the desk and looked at her blueprints for a long time. Then she picked up her phone, called her mother, and said, "It's done." Her mother said, "Good." That was all either of them needed. The fallout moved fast, the way public dismantling of political careers always did. In this city, the feeding frenzy was immediate, the subsequent stories cascading within hours, each one adding a new layer to the architecture of Cameron's collapse. By Thursday morning, his spokesperson had released a statement that did nothing except confirm that a statement was all they had left. By Thursday afternoon, 2 city council members had publicly withdrawn their endorsements. By Friday, the Congressional Exploratory Committee he had formed 3 months earlier had quietly dissolved its own website. Sophia Hartwell did not release a statement. Neither did the senator. Their silence said everything. Alyssa heard from people she hadn't spoken to in months. Colleagues who had been at Maison Verlaine that night, or who had heard about it from people who had texted carefully worded messages that were equal parts checking in and checking to see if they were witnessing a collapse. Dana, who had seen the Times piece, sent a single text that said, "He is Ash." She sent back a single emoji, the small one, the understated one. Dana sent back 3. What she did not expect was the call from Richard Crane. Richard Crane was the senior partner at the development firm where she had worked for 6 years. He was 61, precise, had a reputation for treating his architects with the specific kind of casual dismissal that men of his generation had perfected into an art form, never openly cruel, never quite fair. He called her on Friday afternoon, which meant he had spent 4 days deciding whether to make this call, which meant he was working through something. "Alyssa," he said, "I've been looking at the Hendricks proposal you submitted in September." She waited. "The mixed-use development, the Lower East Side site." "I remember it," she said evenly. It was the project she had brought to Maison Verlaine in her blueprints, the one she had wanted to show Cameron before she understood what that dinner actually was. "We passed on it at the time. I want to revisit that decision." A pause, the kind of pause Richard Crane used when he was about to say something that cost him something. "I think we were short-sighted." She sat at her desk and kept her voice completely level. "What changed?" "I had a meeting this week." Another pause. "With a representative of D'Angelo Holdings. They're interested in backing the project. They specifically requested you as the lead architect." She went still. "D'Angelo Holdings. Thomas's company." She had not asked him to do this. He had not told her he was going to do this. She sat with the phone against her ear and felt two things simultaneously: a sharp electric recognition that Thomas had moved on her behalf without being asked, and a harder, colder question about what that meant and whether she should want it. "I'd need to think about the structure of any new arrangement," she said, "in terms of how credit and ownership are assigned." "Of course," Richard said, in the voice of a man who had just realized that the dynamic between them had shifted and was still calculating how much. "We can discuss that." She hung up. She sat for 30 seconds. Then she called Thomas. He picked up on the second ring. "D'Angelo Holdings," she said, "the Hendricks project." A brief silence. "You heard from Crane?" "Today." She kept her voice measured. "You didn't tell me you were doing that." "No," he said, "I didn't. We agreed that my professional life was separate from the arrangement. The arrangement requires that your profile is elevated. A wife with a credible, visible career strengthens every public appearance we make together. Backing the Hendricks project serves that purpose." He paused. "I also looked at the proposal. It's exceptional work. It deserved to be backed regardless of anything else." She pressed two fingers against her temple. "Thomas, I'm not trying to control your career." "Then what are you trying to do?" Another pause. Longer this time. The kind of pause that she was learning meant he was working towards something honest rather than something strategic. "I'm trying to make sure," he said carefully, "that when this arrangement ends, you walk away with more than you came in with, in every respect." His voice was even, but there was something underneath it, something deliberate, almost careful in the way he chose each word. "The money was always part of that. The project is another part. Whether you use Crane's firm or leave and build your own, that decision belongs entirely to you. But the backing is real either way." She was quiet. "You're angry," he said. "I'm deciding whether to be." "That's different from my expectation." "What did you expect?" Anger immediately. She looked at the blueprints on her desk. The Lower East Side project with its 6 months of her thinking built into every line. The thing she had carried into the worst dinner of her life because she had still believed, even that night, that she was with someone who would want to see what she'd built. Next time she said, "You tell me before." "Agreed." She hung up. And then she sat with the strange, uncomfortable awareness that Thomas D'Angelo, a man she had known for less than 3 weeks, a man she had married in City Hall on a gray November morning for $2 million in an act of professional destruction, had looked at her work and decided it deserved to exist in the world. Cameron had never once asked to see the blueprints. That realization arrived quietly without drama and sat in her chest with a weight she hadn't been expecting. The first public event was the following Saturday, a charity gala for a children's hospital foundation, the kind of evening that served as the social infrastructure of the city's upper tier, where the real business was never the announced business. Thomas appeared at her door at 7 in a black tuxedo, and she came out in a deep green dress. She had chosen herself, and he looked at her for one measured moment before he said simply, "Ready?" "Yes." In the car, he handed her a folded card. She opened it. Inside was a list of 12 names guests who would be present, their relevant connections, the one or two things each of them would respond warmly to if mentioned naturally in conversation. It was meticulous. It was also, she recognized immediately, the work of someone who had prepared for every version of this evening. "You researched all of them," she said. "Caruso did." He glanced at the card. "I reviewed it." She looked at the list. "Marcus Weil," she read. "Architect, Weil and Associates." He admires work that prioritizes community function over aesthetics. Don't let him start on the Hudson Yards development unless you have 20 minutes. She looked up. He was almost smiling. Almost. You did your homework, she said. I always do. She folded the card and put it in her clutch. So do I, she said. I already knew about Marcus Weil. This time he did smile. Small contained the kind of smile that happened despite a person rather than because of them, the best kind. They walked into that gala side by side and the room registered them. She felt it, the particular shift that happens when an unexpected pairing enters a space that knows both names separately and is now recalculating what it means to see them together. Thomas D'Angelo and a woman no one had seen on his arm before. A woman who, as of 11 days ago, every person in the city who followed political news knew had been publicly discarded by Cameron Price. A woman who was now apparently the wife of one of the most quietly influential men in the room. 3 people approached within the first 4 minutes. She handled all 3 with the ease that 6 years of presenting architectural proposals in hostile boardrooms had built into her warmly precisely without giving away more than she intended. Thomas stood beside her and said very little and let her run the room, and she understood from the quality of his silence that this was deliberate. He was watching her work, and he was satisfied with what he was watching. An hour in between the cocktail reception and the formal program, she stepped away briefly to the edge of the room and Thomas materialized beside her with 2 glasses of sparkling water. He had noticed apparently that she'd only sipped wine and stood next to her without requiring conversation. Cameron is here, he said. She didn't move. Where? 11 o'clock, by the bar. He arrived 20 minutes ago. A pause. He saw you when you walked in. He's been watching you since. She picked up her water. Her hand was steady. And Sophia, not with him. Something clicked into place. Of course, the story had broken 4 days ago. Sophia Hartwell's family was in crisis management mode. Cameron was navigating the opening stage of a professional catastrophe, which meant he was at this gala because not being here would have looked like guilt, and he was alone because Sophia's family had pulled her back until the lawyers could figure out the exposure. He was performing normal. She recognized it because she had watched him perform normal for 14 months and had believed it. Do you want to leave? Thomas asked. No, she said it without hesitation. Do you want to approach him? She thought about it for 2 full seconds. No, she said again. I want him to watch me enjoy myself. That's worse. She felt Thomas look at her. And then she heard in his voice something she hadn't heard before, something that functioned like genuine admiration, unguarded and immediate. Yes, he said, it is. She turned toward the room, toward the crowd and the program beginning at the far end, and the 12 people on the card in her clutch. And she stood straight in the green dress she had chosen herself with the plain white gold ring on her left hand, and she let Cameron Price watch. She did not look at him once, not all evening. And when Thomas put his hand briefly against the small of her back to guide her toward their table, the lightest, most professional one, the kind that performed partnership for the room, she felt the warmth of it through the fabric and thought with the clarity of someone who was slowly, unexpectedly beginning to understand a man she had agreed to use and be used by. He is not what he appeared to be from the alley. He is larger than that, more complicated than that, and she was against all reasonable expectation beginning to find that interesting. She had been living in Thomas D'Angelo's apartment for 3 weeks before she found the photograph. It wasn't hidden. That was the thing that stopped her. It was sitting in plain view on the second shelf of the bookcase in the hallway between a dog-eared copy of a Cormac McCarthy novel and a small ceramic bowl that held spare keys. A silver frame, simple, the kind you don't notice until you're close enough to actually see what's inside it. She noticed it on a Tuesday morning because she was running late and had grabbed her coat from the hallway closet and knocked the ceramic bowl sideways. And when she reached to straighten it, she was suddenly eye level with the photograph. A woman, dark-haired, laughing, caught mid-turn in the way photographs catch people when they aren't posing the best kind. The kind that shows you the actual person rather than the version they offer to cameras. She was young in the photograph, early 30s, maybe younger. And even in the fraction of a second before Alyssa looked away, she understood 2 things simultaneously, that this woman was beautiful in a way that was entirely unrelated to any performance of beauty, and that whoever had taken this photograph had been someone the woman trusted completely. She straightened the bowl. She picked up her bag. She left for work. She didn't ask about it that day, or the next. She filed it the way she filed things she wasn't ready to examine yet carefully in a place she could access when she was prepared to deal with what she found. She asked about it on Thursday. They had developed over 3 weeks the outline of a shared routine, not intimate, not domestic in any romantic sense, but functional. They ate dinner together approximately 4 nights a week because their schedules aligned, and because eating alone in a 31st floor apartment with the other person 12 feet away in a study was a level of performative distance that neither of them had the patience for. They talked. Carefully at first, then less carefully, the way two people who are spending significant time in the same space inevitably begin to lower the fencing around the parts of themselves they'd planned to keep private. He talked about work, not the underlying machinery of whatever Thomas D'Angelo actually ran, but the architectural work, the negotiations, the partnerships, the way a business relationship could be as precisely engineered as a building if you understood which elements were load-bearing and which were cosmetic. She talked about the Hendricks project, which she had decided to pursue independently using D'Angelo Holdings as backing, but outside of Crane's firm, a decision she had made in one clear-eyed hour and then communicated to Richard Crane in a single phone call that was the most professionally satisfying 3 minutes of her year. On Thursday evening after dinner, she set down her water glass and said, "The photograph in the hallway, the silver frame." Thomas went still. It was not a dramatic stillness, just a specific quality of attention that meant a topic had arrived that he had not prepared for. Her name was Renata, he said, was. The past tense landed with all the weight past tenses carried when the subject of them had been loved. "I'm sorry," Alyssa said. She meant it without complication. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "She died 4 years ago. She was sick for 2 years before that." He said it the way he said everything, with the flatness of a man who has worked very hard to keep feeling from overtaking fact. "We were together for 6 years. Were you going to marry her?" A pause. "Yes." She sat with that. She thought about the apartment, the precision of it, the way every object had been chosen and placed, the way nothing was there without a reason. She thought about the photograph on the second shelf, not hidden, but not displayed either, sitting in that particular middle space of something that belonged in the room but couldn't quite be moved to the center of it. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "The photograph?" "No." She said it honestly. "It tells me something true about you. I'd rather know true things." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Most people find it unusual. A man in my position keeping—" He stopped, started again differently. "The people I work with consider sentiment a liability. Then they don't understand what it actually costs to get rid of it," she said. "The sentiment doesn't disappear. It just goes somewhere you can't see it. That's worse." He was quiet, but the quality of his quiet had changed. It was not the managed quiet of a man maintaining distance. It was the quiet of someone actually listening. "She would have thought this arrangement was hilarious," he said. Alyssa blinked. She hadn't expected humor. She hadn't expected him to offer it, or to find that it landed the way it did, warm and real, like a door opening in a room she hadn't known was closed. "In a good way?" she asked. She had a very particular sense of humor. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the kind that belongs to a memory. "She would have liked you. She respected people who didn't apologize for knowing what they were worth." Alyssa looked at him across the table and felt the ground of this arrangement shift slightly beneath her feet. Not dangerously, but perceptibly. The way a building responds to temperature change, the structure is the same, but something in the material is different than it was. She picked up her water glass. "Tell me something else true," she said. He considered her. "The Marchetti partnership finalized yesterday. $22 million in construction investment across 3 sites in Brooklyn. It wouldn't have happened without Thursday's dinner." "That's a business truth." "Yes." "I meant something else." He looked at her with that careful, layered attention. Then he said, "I haven't eaten dinner with another person 4 nights in a row since Renata." He said it simply, without apparent vulnerability, the way he stated all facts. But the fact itself was large enough that its size was the vulnerability. "I didn't realize that until last week." She set her glass down. "Is that a problem?" "I don't know yet." She nodded slowly. "Honest answer." "I try." She stood to clear the plates, and he stood at the same moment, and they nearly collided in the narrow space between the table and the counter, and for 1 second they were closer than their agreement had ever required them to be close enough that she could see the grain of his jaw and the particular expression in his eyes when he wasn't managing it, when something had gotten through before he could road it into composure. He stepped back, she stepped back. The plates were cleared. The moment dissolved into the reliable normality of two people in a kitchen. But it had happened, and they both knew it had happened, and neither of them said so, and the not saying was its own kind of admission. The crisis came on a Friday, 3.5 weeks into the arrangement, at 11:45 at night. Alyssa was awake at her drafting table when she heard his voice from the study. Not the words, just the tone, the specific register of controlled urgency that she'd learned meant something had gone wrong in the machinery of his world. She heard it for approximately 4 minutes, and then the study door opened and Thomas appeared in the hallway with his jacket on and his face arranged into the version of itself that gave nothing away. "I need to go out," he said. "It's almost midnight." "I know." He looked at her. "Don't wait up." "Thomas," she turned in her chair. "What happened?" A pause, the pause that meant he was calculating what he could tell her against the fourth condition of their contract. "One of my people is in trouble," he said. "I need to handle it directly." "Is it dangerous?" Another pause. Longer. "Potentially." She looked at him for a 3-second beat. Then she said, "Come back." He stopped. The words had not been what he was expecting. She could see it in the way he paused at the hallway entrance, not the controlled pause of calculation, but the involuntary pause of surprise. "I intend to," he said. "I know." She turned back to her drafting table. "I'm just saying it out loud." She didn't sleep. She was not at peace about the fact that she lay in her room with the drafting light still on under the door and listened for the sound of the front door at a level of attention that went significantly beyond what their arrangement required. She told herself it was reasonable concern. She told herself that any person sharing a residence with another would feel the same way. She did not find either argument entirely convincing. He came back at 3:47 in the morning. She heard the front door. She heard his footsteps in the hallway. She heard them stop outside her door for approximately 2 seconds, not knocking, not entering, just stopping, and then continue to his own room. At breakfast, he appeared in the kitchen at 7. He looked tired in a way that he normally didn't allow himself to look. The controlled precision of his usual presentation was slightly worn at the edges, the way expensive material shows stress before it tears. "Handled?" she asked without looking up from her coffee. "Yes." "Anyone hurt?" "My person has a broken arm." Everyone else walked away. She looked up at that. He met her eyes. She wanted to ask more and knew from the line of his jaw and the weight of the fourth condition between them that more was not available this morning. "Good," she said, and pushed a second cup of coffee toward him. He sat down, he drank the coffee. Outside, the city was doing what the city always did, indifferent and relentless, and in the apartment they sat in the kind of silence that had become, without either of them formally deciding, comfortable. The complication arrived in human form 4 days later on a Tuesday in the person of a woman named Giada Conti. Alyssa was working from the apartment, spread across the dining table with the Hendrix plans and her laptop and 3 different colored markers, when the doorbell rang, which it almost never did because everyone in Thomas's life went through Caruso. She answered it because Thomas was in his study and she was closer. The woman on the other side was stunning in the way that announced itself without effort. Dark hair, extraordinary bone structure, a coat that cost more than most people's rent, and the specific expression of someone who had expected a different answer when the door opened. "You must be the architect," she said. Her accent was faintly Italian. Her tone was faintly something else, cooler, more appraising. "I am," Alyssa said, "and you are." "Giada Conti." She said it the way Thomas said his own name, as if the name itself carried enough information that further introduction was redundant. "I need to speak with Thomas." "Does Thomas know you're here?" "Thomas and I don't always announce ourselves to each other." She smiled, and it was a beautiful smile that had very little warmth in it. "We have a long history." Alyssa held the door at its current angle, open enough for conversation, not wide enough to be an invitation. She said nothing because saying nothing was sometimes more effective than anything you could say. Thomas appeared behind her. She felt him, for she heard him, the particular gravitational quality his presence had, the way the air in a space organized itself differently when he was in it. "Giada." His voice was flat in a specific way that told her everything. Not flat like he was concealing emotion. Flat like emotion wasn't the issue, and he needed her to understand that immediately. Giada's gaze moved from Alyssa to Thomas, and her smile shifted smaller private, the smile of a woman recalibrating. I heard you'd gotten married. I needed to see it for myself. You've seen it, Thomas said. Alyssa, he put a hand lightly on Alyssa's shoulder, not possessive, not theatrical, just present. This is Giada Conti. Her father and mine had a long business relationship. She and I grew up in adjacent circles. Adjacent circles. Alyssa filed the phrasing, the tone, the way Giada looked at Thomas with the specific mixture of familiarity and unresolved something that only came from a history with sharp edges. What do you need, Giada? Thomas said. She looked at Alyssa for a long moment, then at Thomas. Then she said something in Italian, low and rapid. Thomas responded in Italian, 3 words just as low. Whatever he said made Giada's jaw tighten, subtly controlled, and then she looked back at Alyssa with an expression that was for the first time something approaching genuine. It's a pleasure, she said in English. I hope Thomas knows what he has. She left. Alyssa closed the door and turned around. Thomas was already walking back toward his study. Thomas? He stopped. What did she say in Italian? A pause. She watched his back, his shoulders, the precise tension in them. She said you looked like someone who actually knew her own worth. She asked if I understood the difference. Alyssa was quiet for a moment. And you said, he turned then, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not open, not unguarded, but tilted toward it. On the edge of it, like a man standing in a doorway who has not yet decided whether to step through. I said yes, he said, because I do. He went back to his study. She went back to her blueprints. But for the next 40 minutes, she couldn't concentrate on load distribution, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that the reason was not Giada Conti. The invitation arrived the following week by courier, heavy cream cardstock, the kind of formal that didn't need to announce itself. The Marchetti family was hosting a dinner at their estate in Connecticut. Formal, extended family in attendance. The kind of event that signaled the Marchetti partnership had moved from professional negotiation into something more like acceptance. Thomas handed her the invitation at breakfast. She read it, then she looked at him. Extended family, she said. Yes. How extended? Antonio has 4 siblings, Elena has 3. There will be approximately 30 people. She set the invitation down. 30 people who will want to know our story. 30 people who will already have a version of our story from Antonio and Elena. What they'll want to know is whether the story matches the people. She looked at him. And if they find cracks, they won't, he said. Not arrogant, certain. And the certainty was not in himself alone, she understood that. It was in both of them. She nodded slowly. Connecticut. Saturday, we'll go up in the morning. I'd like to be there before the other guests. She picked up her coffee. I'll clear my Saturday. She was clearing her Saturday for a dinner at a Connecticut estate hosted by a family connected to the organized crime infrastructure of the northeastern United States in support of a marriage that was a contractual arrangement with a defined end date to help a man she had known for 5 weeks establish the social credibility he needed to formalize a $22 million business partnership. She was also, she thought, looking forward to Saturday, and that was the part she didn't examine directly. Not yet. The drive up was 2 hours. Thomas drove himself, which surprised her. She had assumed Caruso. He drove the way he did, everything focused, unhurried, completely in control, without making a performance of the control. She sat in the passenger seat with her coffee from the stop they'd made on the highway in the Connecticut morning, moving past the windows, gray and November bare, and somehow beautiful in the specific way of things that weren't trying. Somewhere past Bridgeport, she said, tell me something about the Marchetti family I don't already know. Antonio's youngest daughter is getting married in the spring. Her fiancé is a civil engineer from Milan. Elena cried when he proposed. Antonio told me this himself, which means he's still slightly embarrassed about how touched he was that she cried. He glanced at her. Elena will bring up the wedding. It would land well if you asked about the venue. She turned to look at him. He was watching the road. How do you know Antonio told you about the crying because he was embarrassed? Because he mentioned it 3 times in the same conversation and laughed each time. Men repeat things they're embarrassed about. It's how they carry them. She was quiet for a moment. Then, That's surprisingly perceptive. Don't sound so surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm recalibrating. She looked at the road ahead. I keep expecting you to be less than you are. He was quiet for a long beat, then so do most people. Does that bother you? It used to. A pause. It's useful now. People who underestimate you give you more room than people who don't. She thought about that. Cameron underestimated me. Catastrophically. Thomas's voice was even. He thought he understood what you were because he understood your resume. He missed the rest of it entirely. The rest of it being what? He looked at her then briefly with the directness that she'd stopped being surprised by and had started simply receiving. The part that walked into an alley and stayed standing. The part that handed a man she'd known for 10 minutes a list of conditions and didn't flinch while she read them. The part that held 30 people's worth of dinner conversation, bust without a note, and made Elena Marchetti decide in 40 minutes that she was worth trusting. He looked back at the road. That's not a resume, that's a person. She felt the words land in her chest and stay there. She looked out the window and let them stay. The Marchetti estate was exactly what she'd built in her mind's architectural eye. Older, substantial, the kind of property that had been in a family long enough to stop being impressive and start being simply itself. Antonio met them at the front with the warmth of a man genuinely pleased to see the people arriving, and Elena appeared behind him and looked at Alyssa with those sharp, knowing eyes and said, "Good, you're early. Come help me with something." Which was how Alyssa found herself in Elena Marchetti's sitting room, while the men talked outside, sitting across from a woman who poured tea without asking whether she wanted it, and then said without preamble, "How long before you love him?" Alyssa set her cup down. "I'm sorry. Thomas?" Elena's expression was the same as ever, composed, direct, slightly warmer than it looked at first. "I've known him for 12 years. I watched him disappear inside himself after Renata. I watched him build walls so systematically that I stopped believing anyone would get through them." She looked at Alyssa steadily. "And then you walked into that restaurant 3 weeks ago, and I watched him watch you, and I thought, there it is." Alyssa kept her face completely still. Inside, something moved, something she wasn't prepared to name. "We have an arrangement," she said carefully. "I know what you have. I also know what I watched." Elena picked up her own tea. "I'm not asking you to confirm anything. I'm telling you what I see because I'm an old woman who has been married for 39 years, and I know the difference between a man performing comfort and a man who has actually found it." Alyssa looked at her hands. The plain white gold ring, the left hand that had worn a different ring for 14 months and now wore this one which fit without having been sized. "He knew my ring size," she said. It came out quiet, almost involuntarily. "On the morning of the wedding, I never told him." Elena smiled, small, private, the smile of a woman who had suspected exactly this and was glad to have it confirmed. "He asked Caruso to find out." She paused. "The week before the wedding. The week before the wedding, which meant before the contract was signed, which meant at a moment when Alyssa could still have walked away." She sat with that, the weight of it, the precision of it. "He doesn't know that I know this," Elena said. "He will never know I told you. That is the arrangement between you and me." Alyssa looked at the woman across from her, at the 39 years in her eyes, the absolute steadiness of someone who had built something real and maintained it and knew the difference between what lasted and what performed lasting. And she felt something inside herself shift the rest of the way, not over the edge, not yet, but to the edge. Standing there, looking. "I'll keep it," she said. Elena nodded once satisfied. Then she picked up her teacup and said, "Now, tell me about your architecture project. Antonio says D'Angelo Holdings backed it. I want to understand what you're building." And for the next 40 minutes, while Connecticut autumn moved past the windows and the sound of the men's conversation came through from outside, Alyssa talked about the Lower East Side project, the load-bearing philosophy, the intention behind the mixed-use design, the belief that a building could serve multiple kinds of lives simultaneously, and Elena asked precise, intelligent questions, and at the end of it said, "The Marchetti Foundation funds community development initiatives. I'd like our director to meet you." Alyssa stared at her. "You're not just Thomas's wife," Elena said simply. "You're worth knowing on your own." Dinner was loud and full and alive, in the way of big family tables. Arguments about football, arguments about food. A small child who escaped his mother twice and was retrieved both times by Marco, with the weary expertise of an older cousin who had done this before Antonio's oldest brother, telling a story that grew by approximately 30% every time he told it. Alyssa sat between Thomas and Elena's youngest son and talked and laughed and ate and forgot for whole stretches at a time that she was performing anything at all. At one point, she said something about the football argument that made the whole table erupt, and she turned and found Thomas already looking at her, not the assessment look, not the professional look, but something quieter and more unguarded than she had seen from him in full company. He was looking at her the way the photographer had caught the woman in the silver frame photograph, like she was the fixed point. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. He didn't look away. And then Antonio said something, and the table shifted, and the moment moved on the way moments in large families always did, swallowed immediately by the next thing. The way love itself moved in families, not in declarations, but in the gaps between them. In the bread passed without being asked for, and the second cup poured without discussion. In the 2 seconds of looking that said everything the words hadn't caught up to yet. On the drive back, the highway dark and the city an orange glow on the southern horizon, they drove for 40 minutes without talking. Not the careful silence of two people maintaining professional distance. The other kind. The kind that doesn't need filling. At some point, somewhere past New Haven, the city still an hour out, she fell asleep against the window, which she hadn't intended and couldn't have planned. She woke when the car stopped in the parking structure beneath the building and sat up disoriented and found Thomas watching her with the engine off in the quiet of the structure around them. "We're home," he said. Home. He'd used the word without thinking. She could see the moment he registered it, the fractional pause, the held breath. She decided not to address it directly. "Good," she said. "I'm exhausted." She got out of the car. He walked beside her to the elevator. They rode up in silence. And when the elevator opened on the 31st floor and they walked into the apartment, she turned in the hallway and said, "Today was good, Thomas." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it was." She went to her room. She closed the door. She stood in the dark for a moment and pressed her left hand against her sternum and felt the ring against her fingers and thought about 39 years and what it cost to build something that lasted and what it was on failed to build it and what it meant that a man had found out her ring size the week before a wedding he hadn't needed to make real and made it real anyway. She was not going to say it yet. She was not ready to say it yet. She was standing at the edge of something that had not been in any contract she had signed, and she was taking her time because she was a woman who looked at the structural integrity of things before she put her weight on them. But she was standing there, and the ground she was beginning to believe would hold. The contract had an end date. She had known that from the beginning, had written it into the agreement herself, had held it in her mind, the way you hold a fixed structural point, the thing you build around the thing that doesn't move. 6 months, clean dissolution, $2 million, and her freedom and whatever she had managed to build in the intervening time. What she had not written into the contract was what to do when 5 weeks in on a Sunday morning in December, she walked into the kitchen at 7 and found Thomas already at the counter with coffee made in the Times Open and a second cup waiting, and realized that the second cup had been waiting every morning for 3 weeks and that she had stopped noticing it was an unusual thing to find. She picked up the cup. She sat at the counter. He turned a page. She opened her laptop. This was the life they had built between the public appearances and the professional negotiations and the careful maintenance of the terms they had both agreed to. This quiet, unremarkable, completely uncontractual Sunday morning life. And the problem, the real problem, the one she had been standing at the edge of since Connecticut, was that she did not want to give it up. She was honest enough to admit that. She had always been honest about the things she wanted, even when she had been too careful to say them out loud. She wanted the Hendricks Project and her own firm and the right to sit in the rooms where her work was taken seriously without having to fight for the right to be heard. She had known all of that cleanly and without apology for years. This was the same kind of knowing, and she had stopped pretending it wasn't. The question was Thomas. She did not know what Thomas wanted. She knew what Elena had told her in the Connecticut sitting room, and she turned that conversation over regularly, the way you run your thumb over something you need to understand better. He had found out her ring size the week before the wedding. He had backed the Hendricks Project without being asked. He had told her she was the most sensible thing either of them had said, and he had said it with the specific warmth of a man who was surprised to find himself saying something warm. But Thomas D'Angelo was also a man who had spent 4 years building walls after Renata, with such systematic care that Elena Marchetti had stopped believing anyone would get through them. And walls built that carefully Alyssa knew did not come down because someone was ready for them to. They came down in their own time or not at all. She was staring at her laptop without seeing it when Thomas said without looking up from the paper, "The Hendricks permit cleared." She looked up. "What?" "The Lower East Side development permit. The city approved it Friday afternoon." He turned another page. "Caruso forwarded me the confirmation. I was going to tell you last night, but you were on a call." She sat for a moment with this information. The permit she had been navigating through 3 different city agencies for 2 months, the one that had required 3 revised submissions in a meeting with a planning board member who had opinions about load ratios that were wrong in ways she had explained twice, and eventually simply demonstrated with mathematics. The permit that meant the Hendricks project was real, was actually happening, was hers. "Thomas." Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. "Congratulations," he said. He said it simply looking at her now over the edge of the paper, and in his expression was the particular pride of someone who had watched a thing be built from close enough to understand exactly how much it cost. She felt her throat tighten. She did not cry. She refused to cry over good news in someone else's kitchen while wearing yesterday's sweater. But it was a near thing. "Thank you," she said, "for the permit, for the backing, for the second cup, for all of it, the whole uncontracted accumulation of it." He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he looked back at his paper. The city had no choice. The proposal was the best one submitted for that site by a margin that made the decision easy. She looked at her coffee. She smiled. The crisis that broke everything open arrived on a Wednesday with no warning, the way the things that break everything open always do. She was at a contractor meeting on the Lower East Side when her phone lit up with Dana's name 6 times in 20 minutes. She stepped out of the meeting on the 6th call. "Cameron gave an interview," Dana said without preamble, "this morning to the Post." Alyssa went still. "About what?" "About you." A pause. "And Thomas. He's claiming the marriage is fake. He's saying it's a business arrangement that you married Thomas D'Angelo to access his money and his connections for your career, and that Thomas is using you as social cover for business dealings that—" Dana stopped. "Alyssa, he used the word criminal. He implied Thomas's business interests are criminal." She stood on a sidewalk in December and felt the temperature of the air without feeling it. Her mind was already moving, already mapping the structure of the thing, where it would hold, where it would give, what the load-bearing elements were. "When does it go live?" "It's live now. It's been up for 40 minutes. She hung up. She called Thomas. He picked up immediately. "I know," he said. "How long have you known?" "Caruso flagged it 12 minutes ago." His voice was controlled, but underneath the control was something she hadn't heard before, a specific tightness that told her this was not a situation he had planned for. "My lawyers are already—" "How much of it is true?" She said it quietly and clearly. The criminal implication. How much of it is true? Then Thomas silenced, the longest silence he had ever given her. "There are aspects of my business history," he said carefully, "that exist in a gray area. Nothing I have asked you to be part of is illegal. I told you that at the beginning, and it remains true. But my history is more complicated than my public profile reflects, and Cameron or whoever is feeding him this knows enough of it to construct a credible implication." She pressed her free hand flat against her sternum. "He's doing this because his career is gone, and he needs to redirect the story. He's going to try to make the narrative about me and you instead of about what he did." "Yes. He's going to make me look icky. I was complicit in something." She heard her own voice harden. "He's going to make the Hendricks permit look like it was bought. He's going to make every room I've walked into for the last 5 weeks look like I was there under false pretenses. Alyssa, he is trying to take this from me too." The fury in her voice was clean and precise, and she let it be there because it was the appropriate feeling, and she was done managing her feelings into shapes that made other people comfortable. "First the engagement, now this. He doesn't get to do this twice." "No," Thomas said, "he doesn't." "Then what do we do?" A pause. "We respond, today, together. Not through lawyers, through a direct statement, public your words and mine, that addresses the record on every point he has raised." He paused again. And there is something I need to tell you before we do that. Something you need to hear from me directly, not from a newspaper. She walked to the end of the block, away from the noise of the street. Tell me, 6 years ago, before Renata died, I was investigated by the federal government for racketeering. The investigation was closed. No charges were filed. The investigation was legitimate, and the closure was legitimate. I want you to be absolutely clear about that. His voice was even and controlled, but she could hear the effort of the evenness. But it exists. It's on record. It can be found. And whoever is feeding Cameron Price his information found it. She stood on the sidewalk in December and breathed. She thought about the apartment and the second cup of coffee and the ring that had been sized the week before she agreed to anything. She thought about the man who had sat across from her in a black car and called Cameron Price a fool without any desire to be admired for the observation. "Why didn't you tell me this at the beginning?" she asked. "Because it wasn't relevant to what I was asking you to do." A pause, "And because I didn't want you to be afraid of me." She closed her eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. "I'm not afraid of you, Thomas." Silence. "I know that now," he said. And the 4 words carried a weight that had nothing to do with any contract either of them had signed. "I'm coming back to the apartment," she said. "We draft the statement together, every word. Alyssa, if this becomes public in a way that damages your career, your reputation, then we handle it." She started walking. "That's what we do. We handle it. Isn't that what you told me you do?" A pause then, and she could hear in it the quality of a man releasing something he had been holding with both hands. "Yes. Then let's go." She wrote the statement herself at the dining table with Thomas across from her and his lawyer on speakerphone, and she wrote it the way she wrote everything, with structural clarity. No wasted language, each sentence doing the work it was assigned. She wrote about the permit and the proposal and the 6 months of revised submissions. She wrote about D'Angelo Holdings backing as legitimate private investment and named the specific projects it was attached to. She wrote about the federal investigation that had been opened and closed without charges 6 years ago, and she named it directly because the only way to diffuse something that someone is holding over you is to take it out of their hands yourself. Thomas read the draft. He looked at her across the table. "You're not softening any of it." "Softening it makes it look like an apology. It's not an apology, it's a record." She held his gaze. "Do you trust me?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then let me finish." The final paragraph she wrote alone while Thomas was on the phone with Caruso in the other room. She wrote it about herself, about the woman who had sat in a burgundy dress at a restaurant table and had a ring removed from her finger like a cufflink, and who had walked out of that restaurant and built something real in the months since then. She wrote it without anger and without self-pity, with the precision of a woman who knew exactly what had been done to her and exactly what she had done with it. She sent it to Thomas's lawyer. She sent it to Patricia. Both of them read it within 20 minutes and called back within 25 and said independently of each other that it was clean and sound and ready. It went out at 4:15. By 5:03, journalists had called for follow-up. By 6, the narrative had shifted from Cameron's original frame to the record that Alyssa had laid out with the same careful precision she brought to load calculations. By 7, Cameron's statement in response to the statement was 4 sentences long and contained nothing new. Donna called at 7:30. "He's done," she said. "He is absolutely done. Not just the congressional seat. All of it." Alyssa sat at the dining table with the statement still open on her laptop and felt something she had not felt since the night of the burgundy dress. Not satisfaction. Exactly. Not relief, but the specific settling weight of a score that had been correctly calculated. The math had come out right. She had done the math herself. Thomas appeared from the hallway. He stopped when he saw her face. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right." She looked at him. "He's done." Thomas nodded slowly. Something moved across his face, careful, complex. "Alyssa, what we put in that statement, the federal record, was true and you were cleared." She kept her voice even. "The only thing damaging is a secret. Once it's said, it's just a fact." He looked at her for a long moment. "You protected me," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, something stripped of management and control, something that the evening and the crisis had gotten underneath, that made the words land entirely differently than they would have from anyone else. He was not a man who said things like that easily. The fact that he was saying it meant that the effort of not saying it had finally exceeded the effort of saying it. "You protected me first," she said. "In an alley in November, I'm returning the favor." He crossed the room and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and he put his hands on the table between them and looked at them for a moment and then looked at her. His expression was open in a way she had not seen it be in any of the rooms they had moved through together, in any of the dinners or negotiations or quiet Sunday mornings. Open in the way the photograph of Renata was open, without performance, without management. Just the actual thing. "The 6 months are almost up," he said. She felt the words in her chest. "I know. The contract ends in 3 weeks." "I know, Thomas." He was quiet. She could see him working towards something, the particular visible effort of a man who did not speak from this place easily, who had built a vocabulary for every conversation except the one he was currently trying to have. "I don't want you to leave," he said. Not a performance, not a strategy, just the fact of it delivered with the same directness he used for everything that mattered. Because he was at his center underneath everything, a man who told the truth when the truth was large enough to require it. She looked at him for a long moment, at the hands on the table, at the face she had spent 5 weeks learning the stillness of it, the rare breaks in the stillness, the quality of attention it gave the world, and what it meant when that attention landed on her. She thought about Elena Marchetti's question. "How long before you love him?" She thought about a ring that had been sized before she said yes. "I don't want to leave," she said. The silence that followed was not the careful silence of two people maintaining their agreement. It was the silence after something large has been said, and the room is still adjusting to the new weight of it. Thomas reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. Not the formal professional contact he used at galas and dinners, not the performance of partnership. His hand on her hand, warm and deliberate and entirely for her. "Then don't," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. "The contract ends in 3 weeks," she said. "I want a new one." His eyes moved across her face. "What terms? No terms." She held his gaze. "That's the point." He was very still. Then, "No terms is the most complicated contract there is." "I know." She didn't look away. "I'm an architect. I build things that are meant to last. I know what it costs and I know what it requires, and I know that it holds if the foundation is right." She paused. "I think our foundation is right." He looked at her with the expression she had first seen on the drive back from Connecticut, the one that had no management in it, no calculation, no distance. Just Thomas D'Angelo, real and present, and more complicated than any room had ever done justice to. "My history is complicated," he said. "It doesn't simplify. I'm not asking it to. The people I deal with, the world I operate in, it doesn't become ordinary because we decide it should." "Thomas," she kept her voice steady. "I walked into a restaurant wearing a dress a man chose for me, and I walked out of it and made every subsequent decision myself. I am not looking for ordinary. I'm looking for real." She looked at his hand over hers. "This is real." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something she had not expected, something that arrived without preamble or architecture, simply itself. "I'm better when you're here." She felt the words in her sternum, deep and accurate and entirely true. "So am I," she said. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles. Not a performance, not the formal gala contact, but something private and warm and completely his, and she felt that warmth travel through the whole length of her and settle somewhere it was going to stay. They sat at the dining table in the December apartment, with the city moving outside and the blueprints of the Hendricks project spread at the far end, and the statement she had written still open on her laptop, and they talked. Not about the arrangement, not about the contract or the terms or the public performance. They talked the way they had been talking on the 4 nights a week that had become all the nights, about architecture and the cost of building things well, about the gray areas that living a real life produced, and the difference between managing them and pretending they didn't exist, about Antonio's embarrassed pride over Elena's tears, about the Renata-shaped years and what they had built in him that was hard and what they had built in him that was good. He asked her about the Bronx, and she told him, without the edited version, the whole length of it, her mother's double shifts in the scholarship and the years of 70-hour weeks in other people's rooms before she trusted herself enough to stand in her own. He listened the way he did everything completely without performance, with the specific quality of attention that made whoever he turned it on feel genuinely seen. At some point, the city outside went dark, and neither of them had moved to turn on more light, and the apartment held them in its quiet, and she thought, this is the structure. This right here. This is the load-bearing wall. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in January, they went back to City Hall. No Caruso this time. No lawyer on speakerphone. Her mother was there, and Dana and Antonio and Elena, who had driven down from Connecticut without being asked because Elena had said when Thomas called to tell her simply, "We'll be there." Marco came. Caruso came standing at the back of the room in his coat, looking approximately as emotional as a man of his particular professional dimensions was able to look, which turned out to be more emotional than Alyssa had expected. She wore the ivory dress again. Her choice. Her dress. Thomas stood at the front of the small room and watched her walk toward him, and he looked at her the way the photographer had looked at the woman in the silver frame photograph, with the absolute openness of someone who has stopped protecting themselves from the thing in front of them, because the thing in front of them has become the reason to stop. She reached him. He took her hand. The clerk began to speak. When it came to the vows, Thomas repeated them in a low, even voice, and this time the words were not contractual. This time they were the load-bearing walls of something they were building together with full knowledge of what it would cost and full acceptance of the terms which were not written anywhere and did not need to be. She repeated her own. Her voice did not shake. He slid the ring onto her finger. The same plain white gold ring, the one he had put there the first time, the one that had been sized before she said yes. She understood now why it had fit. She understood that it had always been meant to fit, that he had known in some wordless architectural way before she did. The clerk said, "You may kiss the bride," and this time Thomas D'Angelo cupped her face in both hands and kissed her real and unhurried and entirely without management, and her mother made a sound that was definitely a sob, and Dana said something out loud that was not appropriate for a city hall, and everyone laughed, and Antonio said something to Elena in Italian that made Elena press her fingers to her own mouth and nod. Alyssa pulled back and looked at Thomas, and he looked at her, and she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "No terms." He almost smiled. The real one, the rare one that happened despite him. "No terms," he agreed. Outside, January had done what January in New York always did, made the city brutal and bright and entirely indifferent to everything except its own forward motion. They stood on the steps of City Hall, and the cold hit them, and her mother immediately put a scarf around Alyssa's neck, from her own bag, because her mother had never once in her life left the house without a contingency, and Thomas looked at this small maternal operation with an expression that was as unguarded as she had ever seen him, the expression of a man watching something domestic and ordinary and recognizing with his whole body that he had missed it. She slipped her hand into his. He closed his fingers around hers without hesitation. The Hendricks project broke ground 4 months later on a bright May morning on the Lower East Side, and when the photographer from the Architectural Journal asked Alyssa to say something about the building, she said that the best structures were the ones that looked inevitable in retrospect, like they had always been there, like the site had been waiting for them. The reporter asked what she meant by that, and she said that a building that lasts is one where nothing is wasted, where every element earns its place, where the foundation was laid with enough care that everything built on top of it can afford to be open and reaching and unafraid. She did not say that she was not only talking about the building, but Thomas, standing at the edge of the crowd with his hands in his coat pockets, understood. He looked at her across the site and she looked at him, and between them was 5 months of Sunday mornings and dinners and crises handled and blueprints spread across the dining table, and one photograph in a silver frame that still lived on the second shelf of the bookcase, exactly where it belonged. Neither hidden nor displaced, simply held in the room as part of the full true story of the man she had chosen. She had walked into a restaurant in a burgundy dress that someone else had chosen and walked out into an alley and found a man who thought she was worth the trouble of an honest offer, and she had been smart enough and brave enough and angry enough to say yes. That yes had led to every other yes, and every other yes had built this. Alyssa Price, D'Angelo stood in the May morning at the edge of her own groundbreaking and knew with the full structural certainty of a woman who understood what it meant to build something meant to last. This was the foundation she had been working toward the whole time, and it was going to hold.